Welcome, I'm Pam Roberts, and this presentation is to introduce you to constructive alignment as a model for designing subjects and learning experiences, and to help you get started with some guidelines for writing learning outcomes. Biggs articulated constructive alignment as a curriculum model that encourages high-quality learning by trapping students to learn what we intend, and also so that they learn more effectively. Constructive alignment has two key principles. One is that it's based on a constructivist model of learning, which says that learners construct meaning from what they do to learn. So it's also about what the student does, which is another way that Biggs phrases the model. It also involves alignment of all the components in a teaching system so that it acts to trap the students into learning in the way I described previously. The model of constructive alignment shows that learning outcomes are central to the learning design, and that we also use verbs to express to students what that we want them to know and to be able to do at the end of the learning process. Then those verbs defining the learning outcomes are used to help us create our teaching and learning activities and our assessment tasks. You may also have heard of backward design, which says that we move from the learning outcomes to the design of assessment tasks, because assessment is often what students focus on in curriculum. So defining assessment tasks to achieve our learning outcomes is critical. The subject outline policy says that a subject outline shall contain a statement of the objectives in this case, which is the skills, attributes and knowledge to be imparted. Objectives are a little bit different from learning outcomes, but essentially the same principle, and learning outcomes is the more common term used these days. The CSU assessment principles policy is also based on criterion referencing, and that essentially is about how the assessment helps or measures whether students have achieved the stated learning outcomes of a subject. We'll be looking more at the CSU assessment principle policies and things like criterion referencing in the two modules that follow this one. Why am I focusing on how to write learning outcomes? Because being clear about what we want students to be able to do is central to constructing an aligned curriculum. There are a number of reasons why writing learning outcomes is important. It helps the teacher to think critically about what we want students to know and do at the end of the subject. And it also helps us to clarify to students what we are expecting them to learn. So that gives us an opportunity for us to match our expectations with each other, and for students to be guided in terms of what we're expecting them to achieve. The fact that we've written our learning outcomes clearly means that it helps us to evaluate whether we are achieving what we're intending. So this essentially creates an alignment between teachers, students, and our evaluation methods. So what do we want students to achieve, to be able to do at the end of their learning experience? Biggs describes three levels to help us define our learning outcomes. They're the institutional graduate learning outcomes, they're course level goals for disciplinary and professional attributes, and they're also the subject specific knowledge and proficiencies, the facts, concepts, technical processes, etc. that we want students to be able to learn in our subject. To that, I've added the AQF, the Australian Qualifications Framework criteria, which operates at the course level. The AQF criteria define what graduates are expected to achieve at the end of a course, so they don't apply specifically to every subject in the course, but it does give us a good guide to what the official expectations are about the kinds of learning outcomes that we're going to achieve. Next is a learning activity to help you identify what some of the differences in how you write learning outcomes might look like. Here are two different models of writing learning outcomes. So what I'd like you to do is to first note the differences between the way in which the learning outcomes are expressed, and then to think about which of the different models you would find more useful as a learner. So what I'll do is give you 30 seconds in which to think about that, and then we'll discuss them. Well, did you pick the top model as the one that I would think is most helpful for students in their learning, because it expresses to them how they are expected to use knowledge and to demonstrate their understanding? The bottom one is quite an old-fashioned way of writing a subject outline and expressing the learning to students, which I hardly think would be used anymore because it doesn't meet our policy requirements. But that model in that model is essentially a list of topics or the syllabus for the course, and it doesn't give students any kind of a guide, not only as to what they might be expected to do with that knowledge, but about how it might be relevant or meaningful to them. So how do you go about writing learning outcomes? The first thing is to focus on what you want students to know or to be able to do at the end of the subject. Then I suggest that you start with a STEM that's fairly direct. A common one is, on successful completion of this subject, students will be able to ... Use an action verb and describe a knowledge, skill, attitude or attribute, preferably one that is observable or measurable, and that you have in mind how you will be going about assessing it. We also suggest that you use a range of levels of cognitive processing, and so to help you define the kinds of thinking skills that you want students to demonstrate as verbs, there are two taxonomies, Bloom's or the Solo taxonomy, which act as a guide for you, and we'll be looking at them towards the end of the presentation. And of course, thinking in terms of how you're going to align your learning outcomes with subject assessment items is a helpful part of this iterative process. Here are some common problems with learning outcomes, and the top one is one of the most common, is that essentially they just restate the syllabus topics and don't tell students what they're meant to do and demonstrate. So that is typically done by saying that you want students to understand a topic, and part of the process that we'll encourage you to do is to think about what do you mean by understanding. So if you want students to understand a topic, does that mean you want them to be able to explain it to somebody else, to identify the key features, to apply their knowledge in a real problem, or to be able to generate their own research question about that particular topic, which would be a generative understanding. Okay, those sorts of verbs which come into our taxonomies tell students much more clearly about what they're expected to do. Some of the other common issues is that the level of cognitive processing is inappropriate for the subject, or that there isn't a range of cognitive levels expressed in your learning outcomes. You can also focus too much on observable behaviours so that you're not really identifying the higher order thinking skills that we would expect for a subject in higher education. And lastly, your learning outcomes aren't realistic, or they cannot be assessed, are problems. Now we'll be looking at the two taxonomies I mentioned. Bloom's is often the one that's mentioned in terms of writing learning outcomes, and it's been reframed in numerous ways for numerous contexts to express the kinds of thinking skills at different cognitive levels. You'll see at the bottom of this diagram the lower order thinking skills, or LOTS, and at the top higher order thinking skills, or HOTS. A lower order thinking skill is remembering. That's often associated with rote learning and recall, and so we usually try and make sure there are at least higher order learning outcomes as well. But recognising, listing, describing, identifying, etc. are all appropriate thinking skills when students may first be introduced to a topic and you want to know that they understand the key features of that topic. Middle order thinking skills are applying and analysing, and you'll see they're about applying in real situations, implementing, carrying out, using or analysing, comparing, organising, deconstructing. And the higher order thinking skill is creating, so that's a generative thinking skill where students are designing, constructing, producing, inventing, using their knowledge in new situations. Here is a digital taxonomy, so it gives ideas for digital tools or activities that you can use to demonstrate these different types of thinking skills. The next taxonomy is the solo taxonomy, which is one that Biggs was involved in its development, and I like this taxonomy for a number of reasons. It shows similar levels to Bloom's in terms of cognitive processing, but I think it gives a more of a theoretical framework for what the differences between those different levels. And so you'll see here, as well as it being lower order thinking skills, at the lower end of the taxonomy, students may only really understand one relevant aspect of the topic, and then they might be able to identify several different aspects, but they're not integrating them until they get to the next level, and then where it's relational, so they're able to integrate concepts and see how they relate to each other, and then at the higher level they're generalising and extending their learning to a new domain. Biggs developed the solo taxonomy based on the learning outcomes that students achieve as they progress through higher education. And so it was originally used to define criteria and standards for grading assessment. So as well as for writing learning outcomes, it is a useful framework for constructing rubrics that we will explore further when we look at assessment. Finally, we have a learning activity for you to demonstrate your understanding. Select a subject outline or learning experience that's relevant to your teaching, and use the following questions to review, clarify, and improve each of your learning outcomes, or to write new ones if that's more appropriate. Then briefly summarise and reflect on your learning from this activity. Are your learning outcomes clearly expressed, appropriate for your teaching context and your students? Are they achievable? How could they be improved? Thank you.